Hello and a very good afternoon from Kuala Lumpur. My name is Ithrana and I'd like to welcome you to the regional conference titled The Future of Work in the New Normal. This is an entirely virtual event. It'll take up 5 days and it's made up of a series of webinars. So from today until Friday, beginning at this same hour, we have put together panelists from across the region and we will discuss on what the economy of tomorrow looks like, how it's turning out to be, how we can shape it, and even what are the ways we can even leverage on it. To join us for those sessions, kindly register and receive the specific day's Zoom link. Further details can be found on our website, www.refsa.org. To get us started today, please allow me to invite my boss and REFSA's Executive Director, Ms. Tan Ihan, to deliver her opening remarks. So, Ihan, over to you.
Thank you, Itrana. Thank you. Hi, everyone. A very warm welcome from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, to everyone who are joining us in this year's Economy of Tomorrow Regional Conference 2020. Me and the entire team in REFSA, we are very much looking forward to hosting all of you physically in KL, in Kuala Lumpur, but sadly, it became apparent in early April that this will not be possible. Nevertheless, we are very, very grateful that even under such uncertain times and various ongoing online webinars and conferences, we are able to have your time and presence virtually. So thank you for joining us today. Dear friends and colleagues, unsurprisingly, COVID is far and away the most used word of the year 2020. Often another word is not far behind, and that is unprecedented, or some variant thereof. Unfortunately, more than 6 months into the full force of the COVID pandemic, we would be hard-pressed to say that it is under control. Infections are still rising by the day, and so much remains unknown about the virus and the diseases that the path to a resolution, let alone a return to normal, is unclear. What we do know by now, on the other hand, is that the economic pain inflicted by the virus and the attempts to halt it is enormous. It is now clear that this pandemic will not be resolved quickly. Hard choices are inevitable. Practically overnight, the pandemic has rendered entire sectors nearly unviable. Economies in which these sectors, such as tourism, represent significant weight, particularly relevant to our region, will have to go through painful adaptations with the attendant consequences of employment. Short of war, I don't think there's any other event that has destroyed so much economic value so quickly. But in other ways, though, the situation we find ourselves in is not so unprecedented. So-called low-skilled workers are suffering greater loss of income than professionals and office workers. Children from higher-earning families are receiving better education than those of low earners. And faced with the prolonged periods of work from home, women are shouldering a disproportionate part of the household burden. Unemployment rates across the globe soared to unheard percentages, and not just unemployment, but also underemployment, driven by a shift to gig work, will prove to be a formidable problem to overcome. And therefore, the future of work in the new normal is the subject of this conference. All these issues sound familiar, but the pandemic has sharply and mercilessly exposed our economy's existing flaws. And herein lies the proverbial opportunity that every crisis brings with it. Seeing their dire effects so clearly provides us with the motivation and, more importantly, the urgency to address those flaws. Dear friends, there is much work to be done. Big tech platforms have ushered in an economy where workers are just another commodity, denied even a recognition of being referred to as an employee. Rapid progress in automation puts at risk entire professions that used to provide decent and stable incomes. And the rise in inequality already threatens our fragile social structures and democracies. As if that were not enough motivation, we also have to reckon with the extinction level threat of climate change, which would make this pandemic look more like a ripple before the cataclysm. To be sure, the task before us is daunting, and yet I'm resolute and confident in our ability of all of us here to usher in change and to put our countries on a path to a more just, equitable, and sustainable society that works for all. The last few months have triggered the widespread realization that our existing economic model is broken. There is now real momentum for change and growing solidarity among us. It is REFSA's hope that this conference will provide you with the inspiration, the ideas, and the connections to make the necessary change happen. We have sessions running the gamut of the issues alluded to above, from gig work and frontliners over youth unemployment to the corporate and labour response, and line up a formidable group of speakers and moderators to drive these sessions. Lastly, on behalf of the team in REFSA, I would like to express my gratitude to FES for partnering with us as a local host to this important conference. To all the speakers, commentators, and moderators, thank you very much for your participation and valuable input into the discussions. And for everyone, please share your ideas and perspectives so we can all learn from each other. Let's build on this occasion to found a better future and awaken from this nightmare to a rosy dawn. Thank you. Keep well and stay safe.
Thank you, Ihan. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Sergio Grassi. He's the Resident Director of Frederick Ebert Stiftung in the Indonesia office, and he's also the coordinator of the Economy of Tomorrow in Asia. I'd like him to deliver his opening remarks. And Sergio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Itrana, and greetings from Jakarta. Dear Jomo, dear Dr. Nung, dear Ihan, dear colleagues and friends, dear brothers and sisters, good afternoon, selamat sore, or if you join from Europe, good morning. It's my great pleasure to address you also today on behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Indonesia office at the beginning of this week-long web conference on the future of work in the new normal, and to meet all of you, even though digitally, due to the exceptional circumstances that Ihan has just explained. Dear colleagues and friends, as nations still struggle with the loss of life and a high number of patients, what is the so-called new normal? The health crisis is still not under control since infection numbers are rising globally. But the pandemic, as Ihan has also mentioned already, will also inflict a tremendous human cost in many other mutual interlinked ways. Like a long-term debt cycle, SME recession wave, high unemployment rates, increasing poverty, as well as further rising inequality. And by this affecting even more those who are already vulnerable. On the heels of the mentioned pandemic-related challenges, or better, let's call it the broader context, has been in recent years a slowing trend of globalization, big power competition, and the rapid technological transformation that is altering the present and future nature of work in ways that offer a multitude of opportunities, but also add new levels of risks for social groups worldwide. In the prism of the so-called new normal, the ideology of shareholder capitalism has been completely delegitimized. The economic model of export-led growth has been further weakened. The technology-driven industrial and platform-based transformation in the economy has instead been further accelerated. However, the informal sector with the digital precariat in the gig and platform economies have always been prone to ignoring decent work principles and standards. Women, as mentioned by Ihan before as well, have been particularly vulnerable and disproportionately affected by previous disruptive changes in this sector, both in the context of the fourth industrial revolution and through the informalization of formal work. Frontline workers, for instance, nurses or care workers that have been labeled as systemically relevant in my home country in Germany a couple of months, had always to bear higher risks and responsibilities combined with low pay. All mentioned pre-COVID existing trends of inequalities and gender gaps have been further accelerated by the pandemic, like under a magnifying glass. During this pandemic, the job market has become even more challenging, particularly for the youth, with many people suffering unemployment, job and salary cuts. Again, women are particularly hit hard by the COVID-19 crisis in terms of fair distribution, since the pandemic and related social restrictions have also led to the re-traditionalization of home and care work division. Governments are therefore even more responsible for a more inclusive, just, sustainable, resilient system, and therefore to extend public spending and enhance risk management. To ensure stable supply chains, sustainable production, affordable education, as well as sufficient quality employment. Hence, it's essential for governments, social partners, civil society, and academia to realize a broad social dialogue, to collaborate with the relevant stakeholders, especially the social partners, to design innovative, evidence-based, creative solutions to not only manage, but to actively shape and use the current crisis and on chain. Having said this, we hope the conference could contribute to the idea of transforming multidimensional crisis into an opportunity, as well as to analyze and define how the future world of work might or should look like and what the labor response could be. And hopefully you will also enjoy this exchange and have fun in this unprecedented time of, let's call it, physical distancing. I would like to conclude my remarks by expressing my appreciation to colleagues of RESA who have realized this web conference, to the keynote speakers for setting the intellectual framework of this week, and to all of you for enriching the dialogue with your presentation and comments. We hope it will be a fruitful platform to exchange ideas on the future of work in the new normal. Semoga berhasil dan terima kasih. Thank you very much. Dankeschön, and please stay healthy.
Thank you, Sergio. To kick off the first session now, I'd like to invite Ihan back to the floor to chair session 1, titled The Bigger Picture. Ihan, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Itrana. Let's kickstart the first session of this conference titled The Bigger Picture. Friends, we are joined today by very distinguished speakers, and I would like to introduce them to you. We have with us here today Prof. Jomo and Dr. Nungsari joining us live. To the both of you, welcome. Unfortunately, due to certain unforeseen last-minute circumstances, Professor Jayati is unable to join us directly. But having said that, we spoke to her over the weekend and will therefore be able to share some recorded conversation we have with her on this topic. That also means a slight change of format for the session. Together with Sergio, we will be moderating and facilitating the discussions between Jomo and Nong, and on some topics with responses from Prof. Jayati as well. So if I may, let us start with sharing Prof. Jayati's remarks recorded over this past weekend. As you may all know, Prof. Jayati is a renowned development economist. She had advised governments at different levels, and her research output has been recognized internationally. Her core area of studies include international economics, employment patterns in developing countries, macroeconomic policy, and issues related. So can I please invite the technical team to upload her video that we've recorded as her remarks. Thank you very much.
But I'm sorry also that I couldn't join you live because of the time difference. I think this is a very important discussion because we know that what this pandemic has done has created a very different world, but a world that is different in almost predictable ways. What COVID-19 and the lockdowns and then the subsequent patterns of behavior and of economic outcomes have done is really to accelerate certain changes and certain tendencies in the global economy that were already of great concern. There is the inherent tendency of the global economy to stagnation, which we have seen really after the global economic crisis. The fact that the recovery has been a very halting and fragile one, and that the supposed green shoots that people kept seeing in the global economy never really materialized to enable sustained expansion other than in a few pockets of the world. What the pandemic has done is to expose the lack of resilience of that kind of economic recovery. So it's not just a question of health resilience or societal resilience. It is now a question of economic resilience. The fact that the economy is actually so fragile, so vulnerable, and so potentially open to shocks. And let's face it, the pandemic is just the beginning. This is a relatively small shock compared to the much more existential threats that are coming with climate change, some of which are already upon us, especially in many parts of the developing world and in tropical areas in particular. So I think that's the first point. The second is that this was a deeply unequal world, socially but economically more. This inequality was already extremely high before the global financial crisis. It increased after the crisis. The pandemic has actually dramatically increased it even further. People are talking of not a V or a W or an L or a U-shaped recovery, but a K-shaped recovery, with the K, the upper line of the K being very, very small. A very small proportion of the global economy is actually doing rather well. Giant digital companies, the extremely wealthy have actually seen their wealth increase and their profits increase over this period. Whereas most of the global economy, most of the people in the world are actually facing very extreme vulnerability and growing material distress. So inequality, which was already rampant, has been dramatically accentuated by this pandemic and by the policy responses. One aspect of the policy response that I want to highlight is precisely the fiscal responses across developed and developing countries. In the advanced economies, suddenly they rediscovered the joys of fiscal expansion. The post-global financial crisis recovery had been led by monetary policy, by very, very loose credit, by the greatest expansion of liquidity that the world has ever seen. And if that didn't really do the trick, and many of us had been saying that you have to have an expansionary fiscal policy, and we were always told, no, this is impossible, it will have too many negative effects. Suddenly in the advanced economies, that doesn't seem to be a problem. Developed country governments are spending 20% of GDP, 15%. I mean, pretty much everybody is spending 10% or more as a way of fighting this pandemic and the economic outcomes of the lockdowns and the closures. In the developing world, things are very different. In the developing world, in fact, there's been very little in terms of this kind of fiscal expansion. Even the countries that have declared fairly large fiscal expansion have done much less. And in fact, if you look just at the G20 countries, the G12 of that have spent much less in the post-pandemic situation than they did after the global financial crisis. The countries that have announced very big packages, India announced 10%, the real fiscal expansion, even the expected fiscal expansion was only 1%. Even that amount has not been fully spent. South Africa announced 6%, it's only about 3.5% has been spent. So there are many developing countries that have really not responded adequately to this crisis. And this is because partly there are concerns about sovereign debt, there are concerns about capital flight and how private markets will respond, and particularly the credit rating agencies, which they will generate a downgrade. But there are also self-inflicted wounds. The Washington consensus has been unfortunately internalized in many of our countries. Governments are now obsessed with the idea that they cannot run large fiscal deficits, even in a crisis like this, when all sources of effective demand other than public spending have collapsed. And so it's this internal pressure which actually has given even a greater amount of negative impact on developing countries. So there is a very sharp divide now in terms of policy responses, which is adding to the spatial inequality that I talked about earlier. The third big I would say, intensification, because it was a tendency that was already occurring, is to do with the nature of work and the increasing automation of many production processes and distribution processes. This was already a very big tendency. People were talking about the impact of the fourth industrial revolution, of automation, of artificial intelligence on employment. But now it's actually much more severe, because the pandemic has laid bare that a lot more work can be done remotely or digitally. And many things which earlier it was sort of perceived that it's important to have face-to-face interactions and an office kind of situation and so on. Many of those are now being conducted digitally, and companies are thinking, well, why not? It's much cheaper. They are saving on a whole range of expenses, including those of running offices with large numbers of people in them. And people are saving a lot of time in commuting, which was earlier seen as a basic part of what they had to do, even though it was not defined as work, but in the statistics often defined as leisure. In fact, it was essentially a significant addition to most people's work time. At one level, this increases productivity. At another level, it actually also destroys a lot of activities. And those activities, really, many of them will not come back. I don't think, for example, the travel industry is going to ever recover, the broader travel industry, both local and national and international. I don't think that is going to recover to the same levels of pre-pandemic, even in the next few years. And similarly, there will be many other sectors which are not likely to recover in exactly the same way. So the employment crisis, which was already acute, is going to get far more acute. And in developing countries where we have many young people still, and we have a large proportion of our potential workforce that is either not in the labor force or not employed, this is a very, very dramatic and serious concern. Finally, in terms of the other tendencies of inequality, there is a major issue with respect to the gender divide. The pandemic has brought this out in another particular way, which is that, the neoliberal philosophy that has guided economic policy making for the last 20, 30 years has really undermined any kind of social recognition or appreciation of a huge amount of the work done by women, unpaid in homes and in communities, and underpaid by society, because care work is not really seen as work in the same way. It's not seen as productive work. It's not seen as valuable in the same way. All our societies have massively undervalued care. Care workers get a tiny fraction of the wages or salaries or incomes that are earned, let's say, in finance, which arguably is neither as socially desirable nor does it contribute in the same way. And yet the power imbalances in our economy have ensured that this huge imbalance in terms of remuneration continues. The pandemic should have changed that. The pandemic should have made everyone aware how crucial care is, and how if you don't provide adequate care, if you don't have proper systems of health care, of all of these other care, then it's not just that your societies will suffer, your economies will suffer. The pandemic has been worst in the countries that do not have adequate health care, and it is creating economies that are not going to recover in the near future at all. Whereas countries that had much better healthcare systems, much better, I would say, social solidarity and cohesion in terms of responding to that, to the disease threat, those are the countries that have actually recovered more quickly, and their economies also are recovering more quickly and are dealing with it better. So these all, in a sense, are the context in which we have to look at the concerns, but it also means that it tells us something about the possible directions in which we can go. We clearly need much more significant fiscal expansion across the developing world. That expansion has to be led by public spending rather than by tax cuts, and it has to be public spending putting money in the hands of the people who are more likely to spend it, to generate multiplier effects, to increase their consumption. And it has to be public spending that is geared to ensuring a properly functioning care sector in which universal provision of good quality care is provided to all who need it. And this is not just healthcare, but it also includes education, it includes a whole range of elderly care, of therapeutic care, of all kinds of things that we don't often factor in adequately in terms of what we want for our societies. There is potential, it requires political will. And unfortunately, at the moment, there isn't that political will. But I don't think it's all immutable. I think these things can be changed. And so, with sufficient pressure, we're much more likely to generate changes that would actually allow this rather dismal context to have a better outcome.
Professor Jayati for her remarks. So she mentioned quite a lot of points, from economic resilience to relooking at fiscal responses, touching on wider public spending, while recognizing the gender divide. I hope we can discuss more about this in the coming hour. But follow on from Jayati's remarks, may I first invite Jomo to share his views. Many of you would have been familiar with Jomo's work. He is a Malaysian economist and a leading scholar on the political economy of development, was a member of the Malaysian Economic Council and a former UN Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development. Jomo's extensive writings have covered industrial policy, economic distribution, food security, to name a few. So Jomo, if I may share this with everyone, the last time me and you met was actually on a plane flying into KL from Singapore earlier this year. So we talked briefly about the economy and the certain topics that REFSA is working on, some of which are also discussed in this week's conference. I don't think when we chat then, we would have anticipated how quick and brutal the pandemic has thrown not just livelihoods, but also into chaos, but also for us, I think, as policymakers, to rethink about our priorities in terms of policy making to address the current and the long-term sort of repercussions coming out from this pandemic, and also putting in spotlight perhaps on areas that we are all aware, but perhaps previously were not given enough attention on. So I think on that note, if I may, Jomo, I will pass the floor on to you.
Thank you very much, Ihan, for those kind words of introduction, and thank you to Frederick Ebert Stiftung and to REFSA for kindly inviting me to be with you today. It's a very difficult act to follow from Jayati, and especially because she's covered a lot of the ground. I would like to elaborate on some of the issues which I think are important for us to consider. First, I think it's important to consider the preceding context before COVID-19, before we focus on COVID-19, both the dangers as well as the opportunities. It is important to recognize that the world has been very different in the last 40 years or so compared to the previous times. What was different was essentially what might be referred to as the neoliberal counter-revolution against Keynesian economics and against development economics. In other words, against the role of the state. It was presumed with the rise of neoliberalism that the state could only do harm, it could never do good. And this view has basically prevailed. At the international level, the so-called Washington Consensus, the shared view of the world held by the Washington-based institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and of course by the US government leadership, ruled, and has ruled essentially until the global financial crisis of 2008-2009. Ever since then, we have been in a very more difficult situation. Much of the world has been growing much more slowly, and this has been attributed to a number of problems, including the preceding consequences of globalization, financialization, all of course linked to the spread of neoliberalism and the policies associated with it. It's also important to recognize that during this period, there has been the rise or the strengthening of property rights, the rights over land and other forms of property, the increasing reliance on the rule of law and particular interpretations, very, very conservative interpretations of the rule of law have prevailed. And very, very importantly, the increased importance of so-called intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights, which have been extended in ways which we never expected, have been extended to all kinds of areas of knowledge. Knowledge is now private property, and the holders of intellectual property rights stand in the way of improving the welfare of much of the world. There has undoubtedly been tremendous development in knowledge and in science, in our understanding of how things can be improved, but very often they have come with a huge price tag. That price tag can only be exacted precisely because you have so-called intellectual property rights. So, for example, there is a medicine for hepatitis C. Many people in Asia suffer from. In Malaysia, which has a population of slightly over 34 million people, about 500,000 people, in other words, well over 1% of the population, have hepatitis C. The treatment for hepatitis C costs about 1,300 ringgit if bought, as in Malaysia's case, from an Egyptian generic medicines company. The American equivalent, with the strong intellectual property rights, costs 300,000 ringgit. In other words, the American equivalent costs more than 200 times as much. Now, this prevails for many other medicines, and you can see, therefore, why the fight over vaccines and who has access to vaccines has become important in the recent period. All this, of course, has led to a tremendous concentration of power. Jayati correctly mentioned the power of so-called digital companies which have taken advantage of the new technology in very, very creative and lucrative ways. All this has been very, very important. And so you have now many companies in the world which have economies bigger than many of the economies of the world. And the power of these companies is not to be understated, not to be underestimated. And there's nothing to prevent these companies from exerting influence in many different ways. There are no laws which prevent them from exerting that kind of influence. Now, many of these companies are, of course, American, but some of them are European, some of them are Japanese, and many of them increasingly are now Chinese. There are different constraints in different parts of the world on what companies can do and cannot do, but the most unrestrained environment is probably the American environment. Now, one of the major features which have transformed the world as we knew it basically begins really from the 1980s and goes on to the present. This feature, which many people refer to as financialization, has seen two things. One, the strengthening of the power of banks, but not just the traditional commercial banks which intermediated between savings and investments, but also, very, very importantly, banks which have played a tremendous role, not banks, but other financial institutions which have played a tremendous role in the economy, which now shape the functioning of stock markets and so on and so forth. So all this has led to a new type of economy, in which what has been termed shareholder value extraction, abuse by powerful shareholders, has become quite rampant, especially in certain parts of the Anglo-American world. It's also important for us to recognize that, as Jayati again mentioned, we have seen tremendous developments in terms of automation as well as digitization. And much of this has been labor displacing. Undoubtedly, in some exceptional cases, they have been job creating as well. But by and large, they have been labor displacing. And these are some of the challenges which we have in terms of what living and working in the 21st century basically implies. Now, two other, and the next point I'd like to move to is about the rise of the rest. As companies moved from the developed countries to many developing country locations to try to lower their cost of production, to take advantage of the relatively cheaper labor which exists in developing countries, we have seen the corresponding loss of jobs in the developed countries. And but to be sure, and Jyoti has shown this in some of her earlier work, the loss of jobs in the developed countries has not been made up by the creation of new jobs in developing countries. In fact, there has been a reduction of new jobs because the process of technological change, of automation, has continued relentlessly. Even with cheaper labor, if automation can do it even more cheaply, this has been the preference of companies. After all, machines, automation does not go on strike. Now, when we think about this, we see that in some countries, this has provided opportunities. That some countries, for example, if you think about what Korea got into, or think about Taiwan province or China itself, and many countries in Southeast Asia, they have become parts of the so-called international supply chains. And in some situations, their own indigenous entrepreneurs have emerged, creating companies, including very large companies. Many of these companies outside of Northeast Asia, including China, have not really been producing new goods. Rather, they have been able to take advantage of financial opportunities and so on to make more and more money. So what we find is that the so-called captains of industry, especially in Southeast Asia, have tended to be foreign rather than domestic. And this, of course, has distorted the character of industrial growth in very, very important ways. So what has happened is that China has successfully taken advantage of the new situations, the new opportunities of the new situations, to develop its own enterprises, its own capitalist enterprises. And these have grown very successfully, so much so that with the leadership of China under much more independent hands than in many other smaller developing countries, we have seen that the rise of the so-called China threat. The China threat is, of course, no threat to many countries in the developing world, but it poses a challenge particularly to the United States. So we have seen, beginning with earlier administrations in the US, a continued obsession, a continued concern with the rise of the so-called China threat, and an attempt in response to try to isolate the rise and to contain the rise of China through various means. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was one such means, and even the refutation of Trans-Pacific Partnership in preference for much more hostile acts of economic aggression has become the norm, especially with the current presidential administration in the United States. So all this basically has led and fed into a new culture of so-called identity politics, but I think identity politics which is very much permeated by what I have termed ethnopopulism. An ethnopopulism which tends to see the other as the enemy, both domestic other as well as the external other as the enemy. And all this, of course, is fed to greater jingoism at the international level, and particularly with following the global financial crisis, what some people call a globalization, and some people claim with COVID-19 might lead to a deglobalization. While it seems to me premature to predict that this will necessarily be the consequence, there is no doubt that there has been a globalization at least since the global financial crisis. The G20 countries, while preaching trade liberalization to the rest of the world, introduce various actions which amount to economic protection. The amount of economic protection introduced in 2009, for instance, after the advent of the global financial crisis, was tremendous and has continued to grow since then. Not surprisingly, international trade patterns have not been changing as much since then, and have grown much, and international trade as well as investment has grown much, much less, even before COVID-19. Now with COVID-19, we have seen how the epidemic has been greatly politicized in many ways, which we will come to in a moment. I think it is important to recognize that the pandemic, having its origins in Wuhan city, as far as we know, at the end of last year, spread very quickly. It spread very quickly, not only within China, but also beyond China. And it's very important to recognize that it was precisely the first countries to which the virus spread within Asia, which have responded probably best. Japan, Korea, Taiwan province, Vietnam, Laos, and Kerala province in southwest India. All these places had authorities which sought to contain the threat, to contain the COVID-19 epidemic threat by taking various measures, but did not resort to stay in shelter lockdown measures. Unfortunately, it is the failure to take those early precautionary and preventive measures which made it impossible not to introduce stay in shelter lockdown measures. Even in China, being unsure about how to handle the crisis during the early weeks of January this year, China introduced stay in shelter lockdown measures in the 3 provinces around Hubei, around Wuhan city in Hubei province. The stay in shelter lockdown measures were not introduced throughout the country, and precisely because of the effectiveness of these measures, we see that the crisis did not spread beyond them. So it is very important to recognize that we in East Asia and in South Asia could have contained the crisis, at least within our own countries, if we had acted quickly enough, learning from other East Asian countries. Unfortunately, many of our societies are too overly influenced by Western examples, Western precedents, Western advice, and many followed the Anglo-American precedents, for example, doing relatively little. And the result, of course, was that the pandemic spread so much so that there was very little choice except to introduce stay in shelter lockdown measures on a nationwide scale. So this false choice between life and livelihoods is actually a reflection of the failure of the authorities, because what is needed in response to this crisis is precisely an all of government approaches and a whole of society response. Without an all of government approach, which not only deals with the health consequences, but also with the other consequences, for example, public transportation, safety at the workplace, and so on and so forth, without dealing with everything in our society, with schooling for children, with nutrition for everybody, and so on and so forth, we find ourselves in a much worse off situation. And without involving and trusting people, without trusting all of society to do what is in our collective self-interest, and without taking strong deterrent measures against those who prioritize their own personal convenience above societal interests, unfortunately, the situation has gotten quite out of hand. Now, looking at the situation in the economic disruptions which have come out of COVID-19 have largely been due to the requirements of physical distancing. These requirements of physical distancing have disrupted public transportation, have disrupted workplace situations. And so it has been very difficult for work as normal to continue precisely because of these very, very major disruptions, not only at the workplace, but also in schools and many other places where people tend to come together. And of course, industries such as hospitality services, food eating places, and so on and so forth have been very, very adversely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. the requirements of physical distancing, of isolation, and I very much appreciate Sergio Grassi's use of the term physical distancing, because there's absolutely no reason why there should be social distancing because of physical distancing. Of course, certain types of social interactions are no longer possible, that's true, but the kind of social distancing which we have seen in the past in many of our societies, segregation of castes, of low caste people, of outcast people, and so on and so forth, of poor people from rich neighborhoods. These kinds of social distancing are completely unacceptable. So we should not confuse the requirements of physical distancing from social distancing. Now, many of the countries which have been affected have introduced various monetary and fiscal responses. Unfortunately, fiscal responses have not been bold enough. Part of the reason is because there has been a reluctance of governments to borrow in order to spend. There's absolutely no reason for such hesitation, and in fact, by doing so, those governments concerned are actually making the situation far, far worse than it need to be. Many of the measures which have been introduced have been measures which have been borrowed from the West rather than looking at the Asian societies concerned. And so they have done some useful things, for example, paying employers to retain their workers during the period of subsidy. But they have done very little for the huge informal sectors which exist in most of societies. The huge informal sectors which include, on the one hand, many people who rely on self-employment, who produce in micro, often family enterprises, or hire just a couple of people to help them out. And very, very importantly, you also have the daily rated workers and many other workers in the informal sector who do not have any kind of social protection. So those people constitute the vast majority. In Malaysia, for example, leaving aside those who work for the government, only 40% contribute to the Employees' Provident Fund, which is in turn a deficient social protection institution. Deficient because more than 80% will not have enough to keep them above the poverty line once they retire from these pension with income from these pension funds. So these are serious problems. In some situations they are much worse. In some situations they are better. But it is absolutely necessary to recognize the very different characters of our societies and economies, and to try to ensure that that governments, through appropriate fiscal policies, do much, much more to help those in greatest need, the more precarious people, the more people in the informal sector, and so on and so forth. People who live very fragile and vulnerable existences. So very often the monetary measures come on the backs of many other problems. Okay, so you already have many governments on the one hand, as well as many households which are heavily in debt. In Malaysia, for example, more than 70% of households are not in a position to save significantly. They do not have any savings of great significance. So, and this is a country which is almost on the cusp of being considered a high-income country. Just imagine what the situation is like in other more low-income countries in the region. So we have to think about policies which are very appropriate to the economic and social conditions in which we all live. Now, there are two elements which I think are extremely important. One, of course, is relief. The very fact that many of these people who have been hit and adversely affected often due to no fault of their own, but nonetheless are required for obvious public health reasons, required to discontinue their traditional sources of income. They need to have other sources of income in order to retain their livelihoods. And this is one important challenge. It is very often possible, and it is precisely at this time that one should begin to think about about providing at least temporarily a universal basic income. True, some people who don't need it will also get those incomes, but they will hopefully spend that money, and that will contribute to increasing aggregate demand. And this becomes extremely important. It's also because they will probably be the ones who will pay taxes. But the formula should be to spend and tax rather than to tax first and then try to spend later. You can't do that in the middle of a crisis, although that might be desirable in more normal times. Now, one of the major challenges, of course, as we know, is that COVID-19, physical distancing, and other requirements of COVID-19 have disrupted supply chains in a major way. What the trend towards offshoring, which was already interrupted with the global financial crisis from 2008 or so, has seen a reversal to reshoring. Now, to be sure, some of this reshoring has been politically motivated. President Trump and Prime Minister Abe have asked firms from their respective countries to leave China and to come back in. And for many countries in Southeast Asia, we are, of course, intimately tied up with China in terms of supply chains. And when Chinese supply chains are hit, we also tend to be hit, just like many African raw material producers have been adversely affected because of the reduced demand in China for some of these their products. Now, all this basically means that the supply chains which we have become accustomed to are no longer going to be there, and we will need to begin to think very seriously about how to adjust to this situation. It's too premature to talk about adjusting to a new normal. Is there anything which can be described even with some imagination as a normalcy in the current situation, or even in the situation you envisage early next year, for instance? We are very, very far away from being able to be sure about a new normal. But countries do know the kinds of opportunities they have not taken up, paths not taken, which have not taken up in the past because of the seductions and the requirements of globalization and so on and so forth. This is a time to begin to think about this very seriously. And I would begin with something very, very mundane: food. Food. All too many countries do not produce enough food for themselves. And while I'm not suggesting that everybody produces all their own food, it is important to have greater control of the food and to have stricter requirements to ensure that our food supplies are safe as well as healthy. All too often in many of our societies, especially in the last few decades, we have seen the increasing use of agrochemicals, which are toxic in character, sometimes carcinogenic, which put all of us at risk. And of course, the ones most at risk are the agricultural workers who are involved in applying these toxic substances. If we have much more control over our food supplies, we can try to ensure much greater care in ensuring this. And that's why, while it might seem counterintuitive, this is precisely a time when at least there should be school feeding programs for children in primary schools especially. This is one way to guarantee a demand for the farmers who would produce this food in order to sell to the workers. So this would require great cooperation between the education authorities, the health authorities, as well as the agricultural authorities, in order to create a much more circular economy, if you will, which will be much more beneficial to the citizens. Now, the other opportunities, of course, are very, very different, but it's precisely for this reason that it makes sense for us to begin to think about so-called Green New Deals, but not only at the global level, which is absolutely necessary, and we have been calling for this for more than a dozen years, but also to have the Green New Deals at the national level, where economies are much more sensitive to concerns about sustainability and the kinds of sustainability, for example, about the destruction of the natural habitat and so on and so forth, not only through the resource extraction, non-renewable resource extraction, but also other factors. Now, the other question, of course, is what do we expect in this new situation? In this situation, we see ourselves being mobilized for all kinds of big power politics, and we should strive to stay away from this type of big power politics, and we should begin to think very seriously about appropriate state regulations. The era of deregulation and expecting market forces to look after our best interests is really over. Now we need to think about what needs to be done, how we begin to think about risk management and prepare for various types of risks. Not only the risk of COVID-19, which is too late to prepare for in some ways, but also other risks, the likelihood of greater floods due to climate change and so on and so forth. So we need to begin to think about how this whole pandemic offers certain opportunities for accelerating automation and digitization. And as Jyoti correctly emphasized, the ability of us to replace a lot of dreary, hard manual work with much more meaningful work and much work which is much more automated and digitized, in order that we can spend much more time doing much more care work, not only in the areas of health as well as education, but also in other areas to improve the human condition. This is how I think we can learn from this opportunity. And so there is an opportunity to create, but rather than waiting for the new normal, we have to make the new normal. We have to make the new normal by recognizing that we cannot rely on outside forces, we cannot rely on market forces as we have been encouraged to believe we can. And these are some of the challenges which we face as we move ahead. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you, and all the best to think about the challenges which we all face, but our conditions are different, and what can work in some certain circumstances may not be appropriate in other circumstances. And it's important for us to be sensitive to the differences in our different conditions as we try to move ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jomo, for the very substantive remarks. You made a lot of pertinent points. I may not have enough time to sort of summarize it, but essentially from macro perspective, as you mentioned, we've highlighted the tremendous concentration of power where the corporations are bigger, some of them, than many countries' economies. Also the rise of financialization for years, driving this new economic model, shareholder value extraction economy, as you talked about. I think we are also going towards a globalization and the rise of the identity politics and ethno-populism in a lot of countries that we are seeing. Now, this is as worrying as it comes, because you could imagine that this is the time when nations should come together as a global effort to tackle the pandemic and its consequences. But to a large extent, from the situation that we see now, it could be done, more could be done, and this is part of the reason why we're having this conference as well. I still have a couple of questions, but I think let me push that later on. Before we go into that, I'd like to invite Dr. Nong Sari to give his views. Dr. Nong has been in academia, corporate advisory and economic research for the past 30 years, holding various positions in institutions, research institutions and corporates as well. He was a member of parliament and is also a contributing columnist for Malaysia's business newspaper, The Edge, since year 2000. Dr. Nong, could I please invite you to take the floor?
Thank you, Ihan. So in the interest of perhaps getting more Q&A afterwards, probably make 3 points with regard to what sort of the dynamics that would shape the kind of uh, post-COVID world that will emerge later on. I agree with Jomo that actually there's no new normal yet. I think the normal is emerging. And what would be some of the considerations that we ought to think about to shape our response with regard to the things that would actually matters in terms of shaping that new normal. So one of the things that actually would definitely shape the new normal, mindful that actually the world has gone through a global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and one of the solutions to that crisis was a pumping of lots of liquidity into the system, and that further exacerbated the financial so-called financialization of the economy. But it also has neutralized monetary policy as a way of actually managing the economies by elevating the position of central banks. But basically, when you use liquidity as a way to manage a crisis in 2008, 2009, you basically elevate the position of the central banks all over the world to play the role of injecting more liquidity into the system through all kinds of leveraging on their balance sheet using quantitative easing and so on. So there's a whole bunch of liquidity, and this thing feeds fed through capital markets, but also it actually has a lot of impact on the real economy by way of consumption. So there was this expansion of credit and lowering of price of capital in that sense that fed through on the financial asset markets. Initially, it actually put the floor to it, but actually then raised the price of the prices of financial assets. But at the same time, it provided lots and lots of cheap credit actually that fueled a lot of the consumption. So what we've seen on one hand, and this is the reason for why the inequality that we see today, this is even before the COVID thing, that on one hand you get the liquidity pumping up prices of asset prices. At the same time, you have this concern mainly on the bottom half or people who actually consume not so much by income growth but by credit growth. Now, while this thing is going on, you have global trade going hoo-ha all over the world. Trade has been growing quite significantly, but then investments have been put in place to fuel this very phenomena of actually satisfying this demand that has been created globally, partly fueled by credit by people in the lower half of the income. So this actually exacerbated the inequality that we've seen even before this. But this inequality, this bubble, we knew it was gonna break. But this this pandemic actually basically poked a big thing in the balloon and actually broke the thing. Now, what we see again as a response to the pandemic globally, it's not just the right now. I mean, Jayati alluded to governments going into fiscal expansionary policy, but actually there was also monetary loosening up, very much the way that that happened in 2008. Interest rate were driven almost to nothing, but there was fiscal expansion. But this whole dynamics that created a capacity to cater to demand of a certain nature and certain size. Post-COVID or during this whole thing, it needs a readjustment. I think the installed capacity from investments globally to create this supply side to fuel the demand side that actually existed then is going to be a huge mismatch. And this mismatch is one of those things that will have to be taken into account in policy response. This is a global sense when countries, individual countries or groups of countries respond. So this rebalancing between the gap of installed capacity and hollowing out of consumption arising from this global pandemic. Now, this that actually will shape this emergence of this new normal. It's actually alluded to earlier by Jomo as well. It's actually to what extent will the what we've seen in the last 40 as global trade expand, the atomization of supply chains, especially, will reverse itself again. Now that is significant. One of the things that perhaps have heightened because of the pandemic is actually the risk management would entail that people might perhaps want to consolidate some of those things, localize it, originalize it, as opposed to spreading it out globally, because we saw during the early March and supply chains were disrupted, and maybe people who are managing risk actually would like to do something about that, and that would create companies actually turning or localizing some of the supply chain. So that's at the global level. So what does it mean to a country like Malaysia? Briefly now, the way to look at this is actually to recognize that actually quite a bit of what we can do is outside of our control. If you think of if you take a 2x2 matrix, for example, on one hand put ownership of factors of production on one axis and say so you have whether local factors of local content and foreign content, and then on the other end whether you have an export market or you have a domestic market. So you have 4 boxes of say something like commodities, for example, palm oil, oil and gas, and those sort of things would be local stuff, local inputs meant for an export market. Then you have manufacturing, for example, which is actually foreign capital, largely foreign capital, foreign technology, but for export markets. And then you have the larger real estate, construction, and even part of tourism, retail, distribution, trade, and so on, which are actually local content and for local market. And then you have things not big, where outside of manufacturing, maybe the financial sector, insurance, and a bit of logistics and telecommunication, where there are foreign presence, but it is for domestic market. Now, the mindful of what I said earlier, now the response to Malaysia's response will have to take into account this, it's a 4 quadrants, right? We can't do much to influence domestic demand. Right? That's true. So we can't do much in terms of affecting demand for the kinds of manufactured goods that we do. We can't do much to influence oil and gas or palm oil and so on. So what we can do, and what we have done post the relaxation of the MCO and so on, is actually to reactivate, to get the domestic side of the economy restarted. But the economic side of the domestic side of the economy tend to be more services, distributive trade, food, these sort of things, and not much of the bigger ones. The bigger ones are actually meant for for export market, and commodities, and also the manufacturing. So what we have seen, that what we have gone through, is actually we can't do much on the top side on the export market, but we have done a bit on trying to reactivate and put a floor on the economy by putting something on the domestic side of the economy. So that's what we have done. Now that raises a lot of issues in terms of how we're going to respond by way of jobs. And I want to end with this job business, because your seminar, your conference is about jobs. Now, if firms recover to do the same things that they were doing, then that's a good thing. But if the economy recovers by doing other things, then all this installed capacity, especially the ones for the export market that's already been in place, will remain unused, unemployed. And therefore, unemployment, I think, will be the biggest problem that this country has to face in terms of recovering from this pandemic. Now, can we create new things that firms would be able to employ new people in the next 12 to 24 months? That's a big question. Now, if that doesn't happen, if the global economy recovers, our firms get back to doing what they were using for, then that is just mopping up. That's good. That mops a lot of the unemployment that was created before. We have a 15.5 million labor market, right? Grows at about 300 over thousand, and we should be mindful that statistically we have a 5% unemployment rate, but economically we have a 30 over percent unemployment rate because our labor is actually below 70%. So, given that whatever 67% labor market, 5% are unemployed. Some of those were during this pandemic. You're going to get an 100 over 1,000 ones. So the real question is, do we have the ability to create new activities that would the ones that got became employed and the ones that are also coming online. So in terms of policy response, I think the pivot should, one is to provide a base social safety net for just to keep people literally, because you have to be, it's not just informal, but there's a bunch of people who are not even in the labor market. 30 over of people in the working age and not in the labor market per se. So what about them, and what about those who are being displaced, unemployed? Statistically, what to do with them, and what to do with the ones that are coming online. So this jobs business is actually, if I were actively in this thing, it will keep me awake at night. So what should be the kind of state response to these sort of things? So unfortunately, and this is the reason this pandemic is interesting, a lot of countries at the time when we need to come together and do things together and do things in a very definitive way, a lot of countries are suffering from political instability of sorts, and that includes Malaysia, because we don't have a very strong government, and the lack of strong government cannot take decisive decisions to do difficult decisions. So that's one of the things that we should do better. I don't know how to solve that problem. That's a political problem. But the other thing that we can do that I would like to put forward here before I end is actually to say we can do better working together. And the things that we have not done, we can't do much in terms of what China is doing, what the US is doing, or Russia is doing. But we can do a lot better to mitigate these guys, these giants, continental economies, by working better at the regional level, or even at a bilateral level, or still bilateral level. Like Northern Sumatra and Northern Semenanjung, the Bimiaga thing in Sabah and Sarawak. These are the kinds of new ways of actually looking at complementarities and much comparative advantage, actually, to not just create new things that would employ people, but also to mitigate the risk against the new so-called order that post the pandemic. And you can bet your bottom dollar that big economies, the large economies, will feature prominently in that new whatever political order that will emerge. So let me just quickly then recap. And I think we ought to be mindful mindful of some of the big trends that's already there in terms of liquidity, in terms of capital, in terms of inequality, in terms of the itemization, the splitting up of supply chains and world trade. I think that's a big mega trend that's was shaping things and will shape the kind of things that we see. And we should be mindful in terms of our response and not too much navel gazing in terms of what we want to do, because there's another part. I mean, at least half the economy is actually dependent on external demand. So we ought to be streamlining our response to anticipating what the external demand ought to be. And then thirdly is actually we can't do much as economists about politicians, although I was once a politician, but we need to look better into deeper into this issue of regional, not ASEAN, 10 member states kind of thing, but even bilateral, trilateral kind of working together. So I'll end with that, Ihan. Look forward to some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Nong. So let's explore the points you and Jomo have both shared and kickstart the remaining time we have on this session with discussions as well taken from the floor. If I may, I would like to invite Jomo, Nong and Sergio to join me on the screen. Hello. For our participants, if you have any questions, please feel free to type it in the Q&A feature. With the time permitted, we will try to have as many of these discussed. Unfortunately, since Prof. Jayati is not live with us at the moment, we won't be able to get her views on the questions asked today. But perhaps if I may start with a broad question that me and Sergio asked her over the weekend that concerns about jobs. Which is how can we better prepare the workforce for the challenges that lies ahead, and what is her take and recommendations? So Jomo, you mentioned as well earlier about the loss of jobs and the relationship of automation. So let's showcase Jayati's response before we have both Jomo and Dr. Nong to also share their thoughts on this. So can the technical team please put up the video?
A general fear that there is a tsunami coming of technological change and now also of different behaviors, which is going to completely transform the potential for productive work. And there is a widespread fear among working classes that there just simply won't be any jobs. I think that this is a fallacy. It's a fallacy because, the distribution of employment has always been a function of your global trade, of technology, and all of these things. But the level of employment is very much a function of what public policy does, and macroeconomic policy in particular. When we think of things that can be done, there are so many activities which are still underprovided, especially in the developing world. And care is a very classic example of this. Care activities, if you take, I did a quick back of the envelope calculation, for example, a couple of years ago. If every country provided just Sweden levels of care in terms of the care workers per population, and I took very few. I took healthcare workers, I took those catering to the elderly, and those catering to young children below the age of 3. So it's a very small category of care. There are many more other kinds of care work which are underprovided, whether it is therapies or psychological treatments and so on and so forth. But I just took those. If you take that proportion of population, care workers to population as currently exists in Sweden, and apply that to the projected population of the world in different regions, depending on their demographic distribution and so on, in 2030, you would need 340 million more jobs. That's the kind of under-provision of care we are doing. And it's because we as societies do not value care as something that is important. It's left to be done within households, unpaid, untrained, as if early childhood training is not something that those who are doing should be actually trained to do. As if looking after the elderly is just something that can be done by any family member, when many of them need very specialized attention because there are all kinds of special diseases or dementias or other things which require careful attention and care. So if we simply provide adequate levels of care, we can generate huge quantities of employment. The other area which has always been a great employer and which also enhances human happiness, I would say, is broadly what you can call the creative economy. And when you think of it, I mean, there is always a potential for entertainment in various ways. And of course, entertainment can be of the very high art, high classical kind, or it can be lowbrow. It can be for ordinary people. It can be folk entertainment. But it definitely enhances quality of life. It unleashes people's creative energies. There are so many things that people could do to express themselves, which would add to the richness and enjoyment of life by the rest of the population. There's no reason for these jobs ever to come down. The only reason they come down, or the only reason that they are not available, is because we rely on the market to deliver them for us, and markets do not. If we can actually generate sufficient surpluses because of higher labor productivity and automation and so on in all of these other sectors, why are we not channelizing those surpluses into investing in these activities? Because we allow those who get those surpluses to keep them. We don't tax them. We are allowing multinationals to get away with murder in paying almost no tax through what is called base erosion and profit shifting their profits to low tax jurisdictions. We are allowing the extremely wealthy, the top 0.01% of the population in most of our countries, to shift their money around and effectively pay no tax, to disguise. And many countries don't even have wealth tax. My own country, India, doesn't have a wealth tax at the moment. So we really need to bring back minimal taxation, I would say minimal taxation, that first of all makes multinationals pay their fair share of taxes, the same as domestic companies pay. And secondly, imposes a wealth tax to prevent this obscene inequality of wealth. This will actually allow us to spend public spending on these different kinds of activities, all of which will be highly employment intensive. Both the care and the creative economies are highly employment intensive. Technology assists them, it never replaces them, human beings. If it's employment intensive, there will be very strong multiplier effects of increasing employment in these sectors. And so you will get a virtuous cycle. I think it's a real failure of our imagination that we think that whatever is now will have to continue. And whatever system that we have created, which is entirely market driven, is the only one that we can ever have. So once we shift out of that and realize that this is a really small phase of human history which has done this, and we can change this. Anything created by human minds can also be changed by human minds. Once we realize that, there is massive potential for actually providing productive employment and increasing quality of life for the whole population.
So thank you very much for Prof. Jayati's views on that. I think she mentioned about the level of employment is also a function of what public policy does. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about the relationship of the jobs creation and how public policy can drive that. And she also mentioned about the public spending in creation of jobs. REVSA actually did a paper recently looking at jobs creation in public sectors, namely education and healthcare. But I'm also very keen to know more about what Jomo and Dr. Nong you have to say about this. So could you please share your view and how do you see on this topic?
Go ahead, Jomo. You want
So
to go ahead
Jomo
first?
and no, yeah.
Well, I've already spoken about this. I feel I would be, sort of
Repeating.
being a bit redundant. So perhaps, Nong.
No, I have a view that actually we're not quite sure what would be the trajectory of technological change and therefore what would be the demand for new skills and so on. But from a public policy point of view, I would rather that the public policy should be resources should be allocated towards fundamental stuff and basic stuff. You see, the things that have failed, I mean, just to learn from what happened in the US, for example, 1980s onwards, because the education system in the US is funded locally via property tax. As companies shut down, one company towns, two company towns, as they shut down, property taxes go down. Now, the failure in the US, if this election year in US, I say actually both parties actually screw up because they left alone whole communities throughout the countries and to be on their own. They got lousy education, lousy grade school education, lousy high school education for 20, 30 years. And that's what you find today. You find today a bunch of people who support Trump, who doesn't know anything about anything, because of 30, 40 years of failure of education. So if public resources are to be used in this country, it should be used to provide bloody good primary and secondary school education. I think, lunches and so on. So that once you have a good foundation of that sort. Now, the post-secondary kind of stuff ought to be done by employers themselves, by professional bodies, and so on. And then we don't have to have 30, 40 universities that get money from public coffers at 4 times per capita than what we spend on primary school. So that should be the kind of things, rather than to have a specific area of focus that we say technology will be in this technology, biotech or MSc or whatever, and allocate resources in that way. Rather, we should actually spend on fundamentals. But one last thing on this thing about jobs. During the MCO, when they defined essential services, you know who were the essential services? The essential services that kept society going when we were locked down were pretty low skill stuff, and people who make sure things are cleared up, things get moved from point A to point B, pretty low stuff. I think we ought to think carefully about when we say displacement. We have to also look at the welfare of the people who provide essential services. Real essential services as defined by the MCO, because these are the ones who are being underpaid, underappreciated, and they're only appreciated now. That's at the extreme end of the spectrum.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Nung. Since we are talking about employment, creating jobs, please allow me to provoke you a little bit by talking about the gig economy. So in Indonesia, the country where I'm based now, the biggest app-based transport company slogan, empowering the informal sector. So I would be curious to hear your take on that. Is the gig economy empowering the informal sector, and is it something that you consider as important and helpful to create jobs?
I think I know when Jomo together in this institute, we were looking at the informal sector. I think this gig economy thing is just exploitation, isn't it? Don't you think so? I mean, companies are just exploiting young people to do things quite cheaply for them, and then the state allows them, and not. I mean, these are people who are unprotected by, in Malaysia, SOCSO, social. What is SOCSO?
Social
Safety,
security,
That's it. Yeah,
social,
yeah.
not just the
social
retirement
security.
fund, but yeah. So people who, I mean, if these guys get banged up by a car in the junction, if you are an employee, you would have compensation. You have permanent disability and so on, but they don't. And I think it's I mean, I may be old fashioned. I don't really like labor to be outside the formal labor laws. I like labor to be properly in the labor laws, and so that the pricing of labor is properly done. One, number two, the social safety net that we accord to labor ought to be equal to everybody.
Jomo, would you have anything
Okay.
to share on this point?
Well, I very much agree with Nong. The fact of the matter is that throughout the world, the gig economy is really a novel form of the putting out system,
Yeah.
where people from where they are producing, there is no protection provided by the employer. There's responsibility for whatever hazards are encountered by the workers. And the unfortunate thing, of course, is that many younger workers celebrate the independence which they are provided with, and they appreciate the incentive system, which often drives them to take very, very unnecessary risks in the hope that there will be more turnover precisely by taking those risks. If you look at, for example, the use of production targets in factories or production targets in the putting out system, these were always manipulated to increase productivity to increase productivity and effectively to lower the remuneration to labor. But because it is not novel, it is different. You don't see yourself as paying out of your pocket. You actually appreciate it. It's not unlike, say, direct taxation and indirect taxation. When you are paying more for the goods you buy or goods and services you buy, you don't feel it so much as you pay when you pay income tax. So you prefer to reduce the direct tax load and to try to avoid direct taxation, and you sort of see the higher costs as something which is unavoidable. In fact, this whole we know from many studies that this has that direct taxation is more progressive. Uh, uh, Indirect taxation is generally regressive, and the shift from direct taxation to indirect taxation has caused taxation systems to be increasingly regressive. So these are some of the problems which we encounter in modern society, and there are actually there's a lot of propaganda to this effect. Civil libertarians, for example, uh, will celebrate all this as in terms of freedom, the independence of the worker, and so on and so forth. But little realizing what is happening. One of the things which has happened in many societies is that with COVID-19 compensation, that many have been allowed to take money out of all of their pension funds. What this basically means that
Yeah.
there will be less money when they actually meet their pensions. And you know, for example, in Malaysia, which is a relatively well-to-do economy in the Asian context, that more than 80% of those who are protected by the Employees Provident Fund actually will get incomes below the poverty line when they eventually get their incomes. By further reducing their deposits, this further reduces what they will have. So we are the ability to deal with this kind of the illusions of modern living, the illusions of modern society is it's very compelling, it's very appealing, and these are some of the problems which we are continually being seduced into accepting. As Nong said, perhaps I'm very old-fashioned like him, but these are some of the challenges which we face, which makes labor organizing all the more difficult, which has weakened the voice of labor, which has weakened the voices who call for social protection, because you live in the here and now. You don't think about the future and so on and so forth. So these are all very contemporary challenges in transforming the nature of work in many profound ways.
Our third session will be focusing on the gig economy, and in fact, one of the speakers is Nur Hisham, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of EPF. So I'm hoping to bring some of these concerns over to that session as well. And also the last session, the last day, we are talking about the labour response. In fact, we asked Jayati as well about how trade unions or labours can better organise themselves in the new normal, which perhaps later, before we close the session, I would also share it and with everybody here. Thanks very much, Jomo. I would like to move on to a question that we have from the audience, slightly different angle. The question is, with most government doing quantitative easing in their monetary policies, is there a worry of inflation and also the threat of bubble burst, which will further expose the lower income group to higher financial risk? And I think there's another question which is slightly related, which maybe perhaps you can answer it as well, is that what might be the social, political and economic effects of a long-term debt cycle? So perhaps, Nong and Jomo, you can decide who would like to start first.
Okay,
Trying to
let me.
allude at the beginning, I said in terms of. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Can you hear us? Yeah. So is Dr. Nong okay? We can hear you.
No, I was trying to say earlier, one of the trends that we saw in the after 2008 was actually this flushing of the economy with liquidity. In fact, one of the craziest things that you see in the last 3 months was basically how the stock market is so disconnected from the real economy, isn't it? I mean, all this thing that they start flushing into the system actually went into reflating or maintaining the price of financial assets while the real economy is free. So it's a total disconnect there. Now, to the question by the listener of the concern whether this liquidity QE or whatever is going to result at some point in inflation. That was the conventional wisdom in the old, when I studied monetary economics last time. I'm a microeconomist, so when I did study some macro, that was the conventional wisdom, but it hasn't been the case actually. But one would have thought that at some point, if the velocity of transaction increases and production comes into play with this bunch of money supply that's there, prices would go up at some point. But I think that possibility is so far away because we are actually on the opposite side of things. So I'm one of those who thinks that there is not just a theoretical but a real thing, a real possibility of that happening. But we are at a point where output is not there. We are quite in a deflationary situation, and our economic activity in terms of velocity, volume of transaction is still low. So that factor, while possible, is not something that I would be too concerned right now.
Yeah, let me come in on this. I do think what basically the unconventional monetary policies which have been adopted over the last decade or more since the global financial crisis, basically they show up that Friedman's monetarist economic theory was basically bogus. I mean, many people have known this for a long time, basically since the 1970s when Bretton Woods system basically came to an end thanks to Richard Nixon. But the situation has become very, very blatant. So you have a situation which would be arguably more inflationary than anything else, resulting in probably the lowest inflation ever an extended period of relatively low inflation. So it really forces us to rethink what we think we know monetary theory. So, I think Nong did a smart thing by avoiding macroeconomics, because a lot of it was bogus, especially in an American graduate school. So what we now, so what does this imply for us? Many people qualify this by saying, well, it is possible for the US to get away with it, or for other countries to get away with it. What it means for us is that we must be bolder about borrowing. We need to borrow we need to borrow and in order for the government needs to borrow to spend. We are not in the old sort of Keynesian mode of the government being the employer of last resort, but it has to be sort of the payer of last resort at least. Buy the goods, let us say, from farmers and provide them to the schools for school feeding programs. These are the ways in which we can reorganize society around, safer food production, more nutritious food production for the schools, for instance. We have seen a tremendous disruption completely due to the failure of market forces and the inability of markets to cope with this kind of extraordinary situations. So you were quite right, Ihan, when you started off the session by talking about this being close to a wartime-like situation. But what I do like about the war analogy is the mobilization, which is often authoritarian. Okay, and this has been successfully done. For example, in the United States, it has been done in some countries in Central Europe. It has been done in Brazil by Bolsonaro. It has been done in India, and it is being done in other countries. For example, the government has recently threatened the use of caning. So what we need is an all of government approach. What we need is a whole of society approach. It does not mean you resort to coercion, because that kind of coercion through caning and so on, we saw what happened in India. You announce a stay in shelter lockdown, and you give 4 hours, and people started walking hundreds of miles to their villages, and they were beaten along the way as they went along for virtually no rhyme and reason. You're giving a license for beating people up unnecessarily. So these are the things we want to avoid, okay, in our societies. But it doesn't mean that government must not do more. Government must do more, but it doesn't mean government must do more in the form of repression. Government must do more to mobilize resources, to harness resources. The economy is not quite working. So perhaps, just like in an emergency, in a flood situation, often mobilized to rebuild bridges and so on and so forth. Likewise, in this kind of a situation, all kinds of people can be mobilized to deliver food on a safe basis and so on, to get the food prepared to deliver to children. Otherwise, we will be having a generation of children who either do not have enough nutrition or are being provided poor nutrition. The figures, the numbers are very bad already, even before COVID-19, as far as poor nutrition is concerned. We know this from various studies. UNICEF did, and others have done studies in many parts of the world. Our numbers are very bad. And many of this can be seen as own goals, because the food, it's not that people cannot afford to get food, at least in Malaysia. People can get food, but the food is not terribly nutritious. And you have all kinds of foods which are actually harmful. I mean, excessive amounts of sugar, excessive amounts of salt, and excessive amounts of oils. So it is not surprising that we actually have a lot of what are now politely called non-communicable diseases. We are obsessed with questions of obesity and overweight because they are very visible, but there are many, many other diet-related non-communicable diseases. And then in addition, we have all kinds of micronutrient deficiencies. of vitamins, of minerals, and so on and so forth, which are easily avoidable. Recently, the Malaysian government has added iodine to, as required, that table salt has iodine introduced. But this is a requirement which has been in many parts of the world, has been there for over half a century. So we really need to get up to speed. So as we try to figure out what the new normal is, many of our societies, including poor societies, should be demanding the best of what human knowledge tells us is in terms of improving the human condition. You asked the other related question of debt. I think, frankly, borrowing means there will be more debt. The government, but I do not. I think we shouldn't be obsessed about it. Until last week, I was very critical of the World Bank and the chief economist of the World Bank, because they were talking about focusing very much on debt. At a time when governments need to borrow, they were focusing on debt. They wanted to get down, try to reduce the amount of debt, get governments to pay off the debt. But thankfully, last week, at least the chief economist came out very clearly saying that this is a time for governments to spend. Governments must spend. Thankfully, also, the IMF has taken as well. But unfortunately, all too many governments and finance ministers especially are beholden to credit rating agencies and others who invoke outdated, discredited, free monetarist theories and so on and so forth to say, no, you can't spend for this reason, all because of some kind of artificial limit which has been often self-imposed on this economy. So we really need to be able to have an emergency response capacity, which includes not just the usual elements, but also includes, in this case, economic responses which are appropriate to the new challenges which we face.
Thank you very much, Shomo. I think you mentioned the point that what I gathered is that a lot of times we have to go back to the basics at this current stage. You're talking about food. So without the right amount of food and not ensuring the logistics of these of supplying of food is done properly, then it will impact on the lives of a lot of people. But I think the other thing that you mentioned as well about moving away from this orthodox approach. In fact, when we spoke to Jayati over the weekend, she also mentioned about this. So I would like to bring that across to her video as well, where, as you mentioned, we are talking about the failure of authority. You talked about the role of the government in this crisis and taking stronger measures and perhaps thinking a little bit out of the box. Where we are talking about fiscal responses needs to be bold enough. Arguably, I think the pandemic has hit developing countries harder, constrained both by the physical infrastructure and the fiscal constraint. To a large extent, I agree with you. When we had the stimulus measures, I think governments did the right thing by stepping in and keeping the economies afloat, providing temporary relief to masses of unemployed and shuttered businesses. Perhaps one of the silver lining of this crisis is that I think governments seem to have reawakened to their prerogative to step in and intervene. But having said that, there's still a general resistance or reluctance to move away from the orthodox approach that I mentioned earlier. So if I want to focus a little bit on that, it may not be enough for just governments to simply interfere, but perhaps we should think about actively shaping the market so that they deliver the kind of the long-term outcomes that benefit everyone. So my question for Jayati last weekend was, do you think that the governments can do more than what they're committing now? And how do you see that being put into place by developing countries when especially one key argument, as you have pointed out, is that there's a lack of adequate resources, so on and so forth. So if I may ask the technical team to put up the video, please do so.
This is a big difficulty. So developing countries, we face two kinds of constraints. One is the external constraint, a global architecture that really doesn't allow this kind of imaginative thinking. There are all kinds of issues with external debt, especially now even privately held debt with bond markets and so on. and concerns about what level will actually not create a debt crisis and how we can deal with countries that have got excessive debt. There are concerns about basically inadequate resources, especially now that exports are collapsing with the global collapse. And for that, very clearly, we need a much more supportive multilateral community. We need a global issue of SDRs. I would say at least $1 trillion worth of SDRs to be distributed to every country according to its quota so that there's no favoritism, shall we say, or clientelism in such distribution. We need the ability of developing countries to put in capital control so that they're not subject to the whims of either credit rating agencies or very short-term oriented global finance, which is not interested in promoting long-term development in these countries. So we need that global architecture. But even more than that, we need a change in the mindset of our policymakers. Too many of them are completely, I would say, brainwashed by the Washington consensus still, when in fact people in Washington seem to have moved away from that. So I think we really need to create public pressure to show the stupidity of fiscal austerity in a time like this when demand has collapsed. And when, if you actually put in public spending to deal with both the demand collapse and the problem of supply chains for for essential commodities, you will not get inflation. You need not get balance of payments problems. You can actually do this. But creating that public pressure is absolutely essential because governments are not going to do this on their own. I think that's very clear. There is too much neoliberal thinking within most developing country governments. And they are, that also, I would argue, too much in the thrall of the financial markets. So unless there is sufficient pressure from the people coming from the other side, this is not likely. I would say that we have to recognize our strengths. In fact, people do have strengths, and popular pressure can make a difference. So if we can generate enough of public outcry to give that kind of public pressure, then I think we will see changes, even in these macroeconomic policies.
So that's Jayati's response in relation to the topic that we were talking about earlier. Sergio, you have a question that would you like to bring it across as well?
Yeah, maybe I can connect it with her remarks on public pressure. So I have one question also from the audience. Jomo, you mentioned the Green New Deal. So let me provoke you by asking, why is it necessary that the Green New Deal is also part of a post-COVID recovery package, since the COVID risk and challenge is so imminent, while the challenge and risk of climate change is much more abstract. But why is it still necessary that the Green New Deal is part of a recovery package? And related to that, do you think that more public pressure is also needed to have it realized?
Yeah, let me, I'm not sure which part of the Green New Deal is being referred to, but 12 years ago when we were calling for a global Green New Deal, I was very concerned about the fact that there were people who were calling for green solutions for global, for an ending, for reducing, slowing down global warming and so on, who were effectively trying to use market mechanisms in such a way as to effectively slow down the process of electrification for for over 1 million people in the world, in the poorer societies of the world. So I was very concerned that not be the case, that doesn't become a choice between green versus development. And that, so in that context, I was arguing that by subsidizing a transition straight to renewable energy, in other words, bypassing a fossil fuel stage, poor developing countries could electrify their societies, modernize their societies, and so on and so forth, without going through a fossil fuel stage. Today, I would say that the similar types of considerations apply. We are now creating a huge number of problems in our responses to COVID-19. For instance, the excessive use of plastic. We are using plastic more than ever before in our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is a big problem. Now, who's going to bear the cost? Our economy, our market economy does not address this problem. We are worsening the conditions for our future. Already we know, for example, that there are plastic particles which are being consumed by water, by marine life, and we in turn eat that marine life, and we are consuming plastic particles which are going to basically adversely affect the human well-being. So we harm ourselves by doing so, by allowing deforestation in the Amazon or in Sarawak or whatever to continue. We are basically making conditions worse. In Amazon, it is increasingly possible that with the deforestation, that we are going to have a fundamental change in rainfall patterns, which will affect the entire South American continent because of the size of the Amazon, and so on and so forth. There are many problems which we are creating for ourselves, which we will have to face down the road, and it may cost far, far more to address those problems. So keeping in mind sustainability considerations is important. But to be honest, there's also an opportunistic element in what I'm proposing for Malaysia. Because there are two reasons why Malaysia is very well placed. Malaysia is the single largest source of exports of photovoltaic solar panels to the United States right now. Okay, part of the reason, of course, is that the US won't import from China. But who are producing those panels? It is not Malaysian companies. And it is not as if that technology is so sophisticated and so complicated and beyond Malaysian means to grasp. And it is for this reason I've been pushing very hard for Malaysian companies, Malaysian entrepreneurs to rise to this challenge. But right now, there are not enough incentives because of the way the financial system and others have distorted incentives for this to happen. I was trying to push this when the last government was around. Very little happened. This government doesn't seem to be terribly interested. But we must keep this thing alive. Another example, which would be very relevant to your country, to the country you are living in, Sergio, is the whole question of palm oil-based biodiesel. In 2006, Europe opted for biodiesel, in contrast to the United States, which opted for bioethanol. Now, the single cheapest source of biodiesel in the world would be from palm oil. But right now, for a variety of reasons, partly protectionist reasons, but partly also other reasons, we see that it is very difficult for palm oil to get into Europe. But if we pushed up if we succeeded in overcoming some of those problems and advanced the technology on biodiesel, we would be in a very, very strong position. And I'm not just talking about Southeast Asian producers of palm oil. Palm oil, of course, as everybody knows, the palm came from West Africa, and there's absolutely no reason why we can't go do much more in West Africa to produce, especially for Europe. Now, if we think about what has been achieved, Indonesians, for example, have produced dwarf oil palm trees which start fruiting and the fruits are almost touching the ground. This has been done with scientists from Indonesia as well as from Malaysia who have developed these dwarf trees. Now, this fundamentally changes oil palm production because an oil palm tree normally can live from up to 80 to 90 years. Productivity might decline beyond the age of about 75 or so, but the lifespan of an oil palm tree is believed to be between 80 to 100 years. Now, but in Malaysia and Indonesia currently, we are cutting down these trees after about 25 years because they just get too tall to be harvested. But if you develop these, if you plant all these oil palm trees on a mass scale, leaving aside the other problems of oil palm monoculture for a moment, that allows you to produce biodiesel very effectively for not only for Europe, but for much of the world, because much of the world shipping and so on and so forth currently uses diesel, not petrol. And there are many things which are actually quite easily switchable from internal combustion engines to diesel. Diesel is actually better in some ways, and biodiesel will be better. Now, I'm not suggesting that we do not think about moving beyond all this towards, but you know, there's not going to be a quick instant solution. It will take decades to develop these solutions, and that's why I think that there are reasons which are both economically beneficial, commercially beneficial on the one hand, as well as reasons which are, you know, where we are actually harming ourselves and harming our futures by some of the solutions to the problems which we face right now. I don't have any easy answers, but I think we cannot just think that we can just kick the can down the road and that somehow or other these problems will solve themselves in the future. Malaysia, for example, is the second largest imports into Malaysia is plastic. Most of this plastic comes from Japan, from Australia, from Singapore. And most of this is plastic waste. And supposedly we are processing that plastic in this country. It is not the case. Most of it goes into landfills, which will destroy our land. This is the kind of logic which Larry Summers introduced about dumping toxic waste in Africa, because the opportunity cost of life in Africa was supposed to be lower. This is the kind of thinking which we must get away from. We are now entering the third decade of the 21st century, and surely it is not just a material life, but also our spiritual and our moral values are higher than they were before.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jomo. Sergio, do you have anything to add on to that?
No, I think Jomo covered it all. Thank you.
Great. So looking at the interest of time, it's 5:02. We have been discussing whether should we want to continue the conversation until 5:30, but it really depends on whether Jomo and Dr. Nong is still available to stay on. So for everybody on the participants, from 5 o'clock until 5:30, it was initially planned to be a breakout session where we can carry on the conversations in another virtual room. Should we have further discussions points that we would like to carry on. But I suspect that for the conversation that we are having, it has been flowing. And so perhaps I can check with Jomo and Dr. Nong if you would like to stay on for another half an hour, and we can continue the conversation
maybe
here.
10 minutes for me. 10 more minutes.
Sure.
Yeah.
10 more minutes.
Then
yeah.
I think they're imposing the MCO again.
Yes, I saw that through a WhatsApp conversation. So it looks like it's Petaling, Jaya, Selangor, Kuala Lumpur, and Putrajaya, I think. Yeah. So things are still very, very uncertain while we are going through our webinar sessions here. Okay, so Sergio, we will just ask perhaps one last final question before we close this main session. Jomo, are you okay with that?
Yes, I'm fine. I can stay on until 5:30. But if Nong has to leave, we have to respect that.
Yes, of course. Sergio, do you have a last question that you would like to bring out?
Well, I would suggest you ask the question that you have also put forward to Jayati in the end, to have a positive note for ending our discussion. Yeah.
Sure. In fact, for the benefit of the participants, the final question that we asked Prof. Jayati, before we close the conversation with her, is on two questions. One is centering around the role of the trade unions in a new normal. We are looking at, the question that we ask is how can the labor organize themselves in a scenario where you have more informal work? And last but not least, a question on looking forward. Surely we can see some opportunities throughout this crisis where we can learn from it and grow from it and open our minds to a different mindset. So the question that we have for her is, does the crisis offer opportunities? So perhaps I can get the technical team to share Prof's video, and Jomo and Dr. Nong, you can give your views before we close the session as well.
Ihan,
Social movements can all play a very important role, and in fact, they're essential. But not trade unions in the older traditional format, you know, the largely male organized workers in organized industry, but much wider coalitions of all workers, which recognize different kinds of work, underpaid, unpaid work done by women, etc. So we need coalitions of workers, associations of workers, recognizing the many, many different kinds of work, home-based work and other work, etc., to actually make this a wider movement. That's the first point. And I think that, you know, this is a period of obviously a very deep crisis. And let's face it, things are going to get much worse before they get better. But it is also a period of opportunity. And I do believe that humankind steps back from the brink. I do believe this is a brink. I mean, this seriously, I'm not joking when I say that this is that we are on the cusp of existential threats for humanity. We may not survive as a species. I think humanity has shown that it has a willingness to survive and it will do what it takes. And I think doing what it takes requires cooperation. It requires coordinating with others. It requires social solidarity. Societies have not survived when they have not shown social solidarity. So with these, I do believe humanity will step back from the brink. Now, how does that happen? I don't think change comes necessarily only from the direction where you're looking for it. Big changes have come from unexpected directions, but they have always come when there's been a broader groundswell of public thinking, of people believing or accepting or recognizing certain things. And so I think it's so important for these ideas about the need for a global Green New Deal, about the real threats posed by climate change, about the kinds of different kinds of shocks, whether from zoonotic disease or from some other unexpected shock and so on, that can affect us, and the need to create societies that are resilient to those shocks. Those messages, as they spread, and they are spreading, whether states try to suppress and repress them or not, these ideas are spreading. When they spread sufficiently, there will be the kind of churning and the ferment that generates wider public pressure for these changes. I do believe this is going to happen. Not immediately, perhaps not next year, but it's going to happen. And so I'm not ultimately pessimistic for the future. I don't believe we're heading for a complete dystopia of mass unemployment, deep inequality, terrible natural surroundings and environmental disasters and so on. I think humanity will actually be able to change those.
So, Jomo, yes, you mentioned something. I think you got cut off. Sorry.
No, I was going to say that Nong has limited time. Why don't we
Yeah.
allow him to speak first, and then later on we can play the Jayati's remaining video tapes.
I
And
see. Indeed. Sorry. Yes.
No,
Okay. So,
no,
no.
I'm an optimist. I think we've been around this long. There is an ascendancy, in a sense, of men in the Bronowski sort of view, despite the ups and downs. But we need to face it. Actually, we need to face it, and we need not make this one in which the government is supposed to sort it out for us. We have to sort it out. I think government makes one of the things that is clear from this crisis is actually governments and society which are cohesive and reasonable are the ones that have managed this well. Societies and sometimes and oftentimes government that are incompetent, inept, have not managed this well. So we can't depend on governments. We need to do things on our own. But I look at it as a severe test. I'm not underestimating the severity of this thing. It can get bad, and for Malaysia, for example, we have multiple. You use the word what three prong problem. We do have our three prong problem. We have the COVID stuff. We have a political thingy. We also have what's the third one? You mentioned. No, your people mentioned that. So I think we need to overcome that, and I think we need to do it at both societal level as well as a non-governmental level, as well as putting a lot of pressure on the government to get it right. But in as far as this is concerned, we need to manage the pandemic first as a prerequisite to manage the economy. If we're trying to manage the economy while not sorting out the pandemic, it will also be problematic. And I think the decision taken today, while I have my views on some of these things, is an attempt in that direction. But it also shows that sometimes we ought to do better than we can do better. So I'm very optimistic, and I thank you, Ihan, for doing this. Be optimistic. The human race will not be. Aliens will die because of virus when they come here, but I think we will be around. That was a movie.
Our pleasure to have you with us today, so most certainly.
Sorry, I gotta go. Bye, Jomo.
No problem.
See
No
ya.
Bye,
problem.
Sergio.
Thank you very much,
Goodbye.
Dr. Nong.
I
Goodbye.
got to go to some
Bye.
family grandchildren stuff.
Do go. Do go. Thank you very much
Don't get
for your time. Uh, so I think we can try to continue the conversation a little bit, but let's go ahead with our virtual breakout session, because we will move into another virtual room. It's a Zoom meeting where you will be able to see each other, and perhaps the conversation could be slightly different. So if I may close this session, I would like to thank everybody who attended this. Given the interest of time, I'm afraid we can't stay on. But again, Jomo, I think what I'll do is if you are free, please join us in the virtual breakout session. I will send you the link immediately. It's a Zoom link, so all you need to do is just dial in. I and Sergio will be there as well, and we can continue some of the questions that we are unable to answer at this main session. And we hope to see you all there. I will now pass the floor back to Itrana, where she will have a few words to say before we close this event. Thank you to all of you who dialed in. The dial-in link for the Zoom meeting is also on the chat group for the Zoom participants. So you can cut and paste that link and put it in your other what do you call it, URL. So when you close this webinar, you can straight away go into the other Zoom meeting. So thank you very much. Back to you, Israna.
Thank you, Ihan and Sergio, and our panelists, Professor Jomo, Dr. Nong, and Professor Jayati, for such an interesting discussion. But before we end today's event, I'd like to say a few words to promote our session tomorrow. We will start at the same time as today, and we'll focus on the company's perspective. The discussion will examine how businesses and employees can deal with the challenges ahead, and how sustainable entrepreneurship can drive and shape the market. If you would like to join the discussion, the URL to register should appear on the chat message section of your Zoom screen. Take note that the Zoom link for tomorrow is different than today, and so therefore you will have to register for the session tomorrow in order to receive your Zoom link to join the session. Lastly, as Ihan mentioned, the breakout session will commence right after I wrap this up. And so the link should also be at the Zoom chat function. All you have to do is copy and paste it into a new window, and you should be in the new breakout room. For those of you who are unable to stay on, I wish you a very good day ahead, and we at REFSA look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Once again, if you're attending the breakout session, just use the link provided in the Zoom chat section. Thank you again, and goodbye.